Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Unslaved. Happy to be back with you once again. And we've been doing so many great shows lately. Definitely go back and check out what we've been up to over the past few weeks. But we are going to be continuing on presenting. Michael's got some ideas he wants to continue looking into, some thinkers, some concepts. And so I'm excited for this one. Always good to see you, Michael. What are we diving into today?
Yeah, well, there has been a trail up to this point, a thread that we've been following. It's been deliberate, and this one's going to be quite important because if you remember, well, we started off, I think, when we did the Four Mysteries podcast based on my article on Substack. But what the article doesn't have and the podcast did have was at the end of this Four Mysteries podcast, we start talking about additional mysteries, sort of that follow from the four main ones that are the big proofs, right? That we looked at. And those, if you go to our first slide, it'll remind people these had to do with this fascinating subject of, first of all, it was based on, I always want to point out these contrarians, as I call them. And there's many. And we've dealt with that in the series that we've done, for the last year or so. But we dealt in that article and in that podcast with the big one of being versus becoming. It goes back to the time of Plato, maybe even before. Aristotle was the one who brought in the becoming more importantly and said, hey, being is kind of vague. What is being? It must be there, but we don't really know what that is. But what we really know is becoming. We are all in a state of becoming, whether it's the growth of a fetus physically, whether it is any other kind of growth through infancy up to adolescence and adulthood. These are all a process of becoming, and it even happens psychically. It even happens on the cellular level, right? In every form, even in nature. Yes, there's being, but when it comes to actually really understanding the world, it's this thing called becoming that we're more attentive to, because we do it. We're actually involved in the very process itself. Now, in Greek, if you go to the next slide, that process was given the term teleology. We can look at that slide. Yeah. Can you always go to a big slide? Let's make the slides bigger. Thanks. Now, teleology, or for short, telos, is this process of unfolding. And we really have dug into this a lot. And it remained important to all philosophers down to the modern age. You have to account for it in some shape or form. Now, what we did, though, when we were covering it in past programs, I was, cautious to point out something strange. And that is, remember, we posted in a form of a question. How can we tell if in this process of becoming, which is movement, which is process, are we being pushed from behind? Or are we being sort of enticed by something in the future? And this was an odd question to formulate, but when you read philosophy, it actually becomes less bizarre. It becomes sort of a self-evident. And it has a great deal to do with the will. Because the philosophers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and these other sort of disciples of the will, even Freud sort of slots in there, they're going to say, well, look, this is where the will comes in. We're putting will or something similar to will at the bottom of the absolute substratum of life, of existence, okay? And many others bought into this, maybe not, they're quasi, involved in understanding the role of the will. Maybe not as completely vehement about it as, say, Nietzsche, but nevertheless, the will became an important thing for modern and postmodern thinking. And so this is where it would come in. We are moved by some Darwinian force, some evolutionary process. It's a will-based concept that takes over right from the off. And we're willful beings. Hey, this was very, very attractive because, of course, it completely answered man's bestial instincts, which when Freud and some of these other people were alive, we were in the middle of wars, genocidal wars and things like that. And the question of what the hell is happening to Europe, the fall of the great empires, it seemed like it was nothing but chaos. during the very times when Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Freud were alive. And so they thought, well, we've done it. It's this will is a manifestation of the base animal instincts. Great, we've done it. That's it. Man has been framed. We've got it. Move on. And there were other voices, of course, that came in to say, wait a minute, I don't think that that's true. But they never got famous. They never got into the mainstream as much. You really had to dig for those people like the Viktor Frankls and Otto Ranks and people like that, right? So, yeah, and that's why Unslaved, I try to make a lot of these people, these sort of forgotten geniuses, right? So we have this idea. Oh, and then just to cap it off, the idea that you might be enticed from the future, if nobody's ever caught any of our previous episodes, well, let's say a word about that. Being enticed by the future is more coming out of German idealism and other sort of mystical, idealistic philosophies, paradigms in which they talk about a sort of transcendent self. And this even caught on, with some moderns. But the idea that there's a transcendent self, it was really Johann Fichte, the German idealist, that came along with this concept. And that we're all the move we're talking about, this move of becoming, is as you might have a carrot to a donkey. We are always moving, toward this lantern that's going ahead of us. And even though it's foggy, we're moving into this unknown. But we are, in fact, being guided by something very, very elusive. One might call it the higher self at this point, although that gets into a lot of New Age stuff, and they've mutilated this concept, hijacked it for their own purposes. You want to be very, very careful there. This had some philosophical validity until the New Age got hold of it, right? So you can think of it that way as well. And then we left it as a cliffhanger to say, maybe there's a mystery here. Maybe we're never going to understand which one it is. And I wanted people to think about it and cogitate over it and mull over it. Number one, it is a big mystery. That, how could you decide? It's very, very important for us in life. It's the theme of my new book, Existentialism and the Search for Meaning, goes into this, kind of makes this a major theme. How are we with mysteries of any kind, not just this one, but any kind, time and space, you name it, right? The roots of the self are a mystery. What do we do with that one? Yeah, and so on. But as a matter of fact, there was a thinker who did give a very cogent answer to this. And I would assume that he was aware of the philosophy, but he never explicitly said that he was, right? I've just noticed that in reading him, there is an answer within his work to this conundrum, even though he doesn't frame it philosophically. He was, in fact, a psychologist. Let's go to the next slide. Another sort of forgotten genius today, very important one. Oh, let's go to the big slide. Alfred Adler, there's his date of birth. And we go to the next slide. You'll see that he was part of the Vienna School, or, the Vienna Psychological Association, or a group, or whatever, around Freud. There's Otto Rank right behind Freud, and Adler's in there with Ferenczi and others as well. And there was a large group of these people. They were all Jewish, apart from Carl Jung. He's not in the picture, and there was a larger group than this in Vienna. Excuse me. At the time, right? Now, one by one, each of these great men broke away from Freud. It took over 22 years for Otto Rank to do so, and he nearly had a nervous breakdown doing it. Jung pretty much did have a nervous breakdown doing it when he broke away. Adler, the same. It was never easy. And Adler kind of didn't even really like being associated with Freud too much later on, and after he had formed his own school in Vienna. And his school was called individual psychology, right? Alfred Adler and individual psychology. And it's a kind of a problematic term, because actually one could argue on the negative side that there's not much commentary on individualism in it. But we'll get to that a little bit later on to explain what I mean by that. uh, it's an odd statement to make. But we want to just keep it. There's so much to go into here, but we won't. We're going to keep it down to pare it down to something very, very important. Because, as I said, this is the man who gives one of the most cogent answers to the question we've posed time and time again. Which force could it possibly be? Are we forced by something from behind, moving us forward into time and into our open-endedness? Or are the idealists right, and we are being enticed by something numinous ahead of us? And we left it that it could be one, it could be the other, it could be both. We don't know, with a big question mark. But if you go to the next slide, we'll start to unpack something very interesting here. And that is that Alfred Adler was absolutely obsessed, critical to his theory, with this concept of the contrarium between inferiority and superiority. Right? He was absolutely over the moon about this. And there's a lot of reasons why he broke from Freud and he started to develop this. It was to do with, his own slow awareness that this was the case, studying children, studying his clients. We won't get into all of that. But the thing is that he claimed that the first thing to mention, though, before we jump into it, is this. When we in English hear the term inferiority and superiority, we have a prejudice. And we associate a sort of a value judgment a little bit too harshly to those words. This is completely understandable. It just has to do with translation. But no, that's not the way to understand Adler. In fact, that's the way to totally misunderstand the guy. We've got to deal with this translation problem first. Go to the next slide and I'll give an example to explain. Freud is where we could look at something interesting, because he had one of these dyads, contrarium, between what he called primary narcissism and secondary narcissism. And one is good and the other is bad. It'll reflect on what we're going to talk about in a minute with Adler. Primary narcissism is perfectly natural. Every baby has it. It's the interest in their own body. It's absolute, this polymorphous feeling of being the center of everything, right? This ego germ. And so just simply the hunger, just simply the needs, the raw hunger, the raw need, the raw desire for shelter and warmth and what have you, is all primary narcissism. So that's how you've got to see it. Nothing wrong with that. If you didn't have it, the baby couldn't possibly survive. And that's how it orients to its mother, and the growth process begins. Then he contrasts that with secondary narcissism, which is a totally different thing. After all your basic needs are met and one grows up, now you have this more ego-centered feeling that I'm number one, I'm first. In the secondary narcissism, that is the one we know when we're really talking about, sort of chronic narcissists and malignant narcissism. This second one is sort of more of the will. It's something that's more adopted later on. It's not primal and it's not natural. It's something that is cultivated, in later life. But this helps us to let's go to the next one. To then understand, when we're talking about Adler, right? When we are talking about Adler's inferiority, superiority issue, we have to bear this in mind, that the words are not to make us immediately jump on a value judgment. What is more is that inferiority is something that every single one of us has. You'll find out later on that Adler himself was a bit of a relativist, right? But as a matter of fact, staring him in the face from his own discoveries is something that actually approaches the absolute, because the inferiority he's